Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Tea parties and electoral tsunamis. Republicans in the House in 2010. Obama out of the White House in 2012. Cuomo takes it all, but 6 New York Democratic congressmen and perhaps the state Senate fall. To talk about election 2010, what happened and what it means, are 2 members of the best damn political team in New York, colleagues of mine at the Baruch College School of Public Affairs, David Birdsell and Mickey Blum. David is the dean of the school and an expert on political communication, the news media, and debate. He specializes in media and information technology. He is a regular commentator on debates and other aspects of political communication for local, national, and international television and print media. Micheline Blum is Distinguished Lecturer and Director of the Baruch College Survey Research. Mickey is a past president of the New York chapter of the American Association for Public Opinion Research and a recognized expert in questionnaire construction, public opinion, and election polling. She appears frequently as a polling and election analyst on local and national television. Welcome, members of the best damn political team in New York.
Good to be here.
Okay. First of all, what happened? Just your gut. What happened? David, and then Mickey.
Well, obviously, a huge victory for the Republicans, but I think a victory predicated to a large extent on the failure of the Democrats to mount anything remotely resembling a nationally coherent campaign message to mobilize their base in any kind of a compelling way. You saw them lose pretty much across the spectrum, across age brackets, across geographic brackets, across political orientations, but most specifically losing independents in this campaign. But I would credit this less to the compelling Republican message than to the abject failure of a Democratic message in this election year.
Talk about some of the exit poll data and tell us what happened.
Well, David's right. The exit poll data show that basically the Democrats lost across the board. They lost some of the vote of every age group, every demographic group. And also, the electorate looked different this time. It was older and whiter and more conservative. All those new Obama voters who showed up in 2008, they didn't show up this time. So the young vote, the under 30 vote, which was 18 or 19% in 2008, only 11% this time, whereas people over 60 were more than a third of the vote this time.
And they voted overwhelmingly Republican.
Overwhelmingly Republican, which was also, a shift. And I remember, things change a lot in 2 years. So what this means going forward is another question, because I will say that 2 years ago, I said that the Republicans at this point had, their voters were old and white, and that was sort of no future for a party, well, wrong again, because this time in a midterm election, that's exactly who shows up.
Well, I think it's very important to note the campaign to a certain extent crafts the electorate. And in this case, the campaign on the Republican side very carefully and overwhelmingly geared to anger, to uncertainty about the health care legislation, to concerns about the budget deficit and what that would mean to entitlement programs. Curiously, in a way, you had the Republicans as the great champions of Medicare in this campaign.
Don't get the government away from my Medicare.
Get your hands off my Medicare. And that was enormously successful at propelling precisely these dwindling portions of the population to the polls so that they could become the overwhelming majority of the electorate.
Wow. Neil Gabler in a piece in Politico talked about campaigns devolving into cliches and that Republicans are masters of the cliches. You do communications, you do strategy, you analyze it. Talk about that.
Well, let me not talk so much about Republican cliches as the absence of a Democratic counterweight.
Go ahead.
President Obama campaigned, candidate Obama campaigned in 2008 on the kind of hope and change agenda that is the most abstract rallying point. Anybody could read into it whatever they wanted, and they did. And
That's not a
demonstrable.
strategy, it's a
It's
sentiment.
not a strategy.
Right.
He gets into office and he immediately involves himself with the minutia of legislation. And that minutia is completely unattached to any arc of achievement, how people understand themselves as members of a polity, what you really want government to do. So in between, you leave the ground completely to the Republican messaging machine so that people can talk about your policies, brand them as Obamacare. That's the label that sticks. That's what people know about health care is that label, and it's a pejorative label. So I think I don't fault the Republicans for their cliches so much as I fault the Democrats for failing to construct a narrative arc that involved their base and a broader swath of Americans whom they just gave up this year.
To a certain extent, a larger question, are Americans capable of dealing with more than cliches? I mean, if you're getting fed cliches, I mean, what's the cause and what's the effect? Are they responding to attention deficit disorders among the electorate?
Well, I think clearly you need always to be able to distill a campaign into memorable slogans, images, and
bumper
phrases.
sticker. Go ahead.
A bumper sticker.
Right.
But the bumper sticker has to attach to a larger body of belief.
Right.
And it's that larger body of belief that Democrats did not create. And of course, then they didn't create the slogans either, except basically recycled Bush content from 2008. So I see this as an across-the-board messaging failure. Of course, Americans can figure this stuff out, but you have to make the case.
Do they want to? Do they see it important enough? Are they committed enough? Or are we talking about an ideal of an informed citizenry here?
People are scared. People know that they are either suffering economically or at risk. They've seen the value of their houses and their retirement portfolios dwindle. They're being told that deficits are bad things. They know that that's true in their private lives, and they see themselves hammered by debt. The kind of experiential analogy all trends Republican. You've got to be able to make a different argument. I think the people are able to understand that, but it was simply off the table.
Go ahead.
I totally agree. There wasn't an opposing message to Obamacare. The minute, health care, health reform, there never was anything on the other side of that told people they were getting something that was a good thing to get from that. But aside from that, I do think it really is the economy. It was the economy. 2/3 of the voters said that was their top issue. 87% of people said they were worried about the future of the economy. I'm going to give a plug to this very smart man I worked for years ago at NBC News named Roy Wetzel, who told me we only need one question on our poll, and it's the future of the economy. Because when it's bad, whoever is in power is going down. And this was a perfect example of it. When 87% are worried about the economy, the only way they can give a message about that and the only way they can protest is to vote against whoever is in power. At the moment, it's Obama and the Democrats, and they took the hit for that worry and anger.
In a sense, they played rope-a-dope, but they didn't have a grand strategy, so they fell rather than George Foreman falling.
Well, they didn't have a grand strategy. They didn't bother to explain their policy successes. And, people have been trying Democratic presidents and Republican presidents and Richard Nixon to try to reform the healthcare system since the Second World War.
Right.
And this was an enormous achievement that put many benefits on the table.
Right.
You can argue about the broad sweep of the policy, but we didn't hear much about those benefits in the campaign trail. Instead, people wanted to talk about how much trouble they had with the bill, and they really weren't satisfied with their votes. Look at the stimulus spending, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. An enormous $750 billion expenditure. Most people didn't know what was in it, and the Democrats didn't explain what was in it or exactly how it was that it took a miserable economy and made it only slightly less miserable. It was a success in the minds of most economists, but there was nothing about that on the campaign trail that resonated with the people.
Right, and people don't know even that how much has been paid back. They think that it's money gone, it's money lost and lost forever, and they have no idea that it helped anything. The Democrats really never made their own case
So this is the Cool Hand Luke election. You know, what we have here is a failure to communicate?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's look at the maps. I mean, if you look at the House maps, the governor's maps, and the Senate maps, excuse me, they are red, very red. The Republicans expanded their base really out of the South into the Midwest. They won state houses, governors. Let's talk about long term. We know what happened in the short term. Let me just read a little bit from our favorite political analyst and actor, Karl Rove. He described it. GOP picked up more House seats than in any election since 1938, leaving Democrats with the smallest number in the House since 1946. An extraordinary 9 senior Democrats with 18 years more of service also went down, including 3 committee chairs. The president's closest political allies lost. This is, I mean, to use the nautical, it's a tsunami.
It is a tsunami.
Go ahead.
But I mean, we've heard a lot of water metaphors in this campaign.
It's unbelievable.
The wave
Tidal
election.
waves, the wave. We'll talk about wave election, rip tides. I mean, what is it?
And I think one of the reasons for that is that you see the froth at the top of the wave, but you don't know what it's made up of.
Right.
And that's part of the reason that.
And sometimes you don't know its power. Go ahead.
But you know, the biggest thing, it seems to me, here is that whatever the carnage in a given election cycle, you can always swing back the other way. However, what is very clear right now is that there are going to be Republican-controlled state houses that will redistrict election districts for national as well as statewide office, and that's done. That's going to happen, and it's going to happen in some interesting states. It's going to happen in Indiana.
Yep.
It's going to happen in Ohio.
Yep.
It's going to happen in Wisconsin,
Pennsylvania.
Battleground states where Republicans have they've historically done very well. Democrats did well in 2008. They have to do well again there in 2012 if Obama wants to go back to the White
Carolina,
House.
go ahead.
And it's very clear that those districts are not going to favor Democratic candidates.
That's right.
What you've got, though, is the Republicans control a huge percentage of the 435 seats, meaning that they've got the governors and the state houses under something like 190 something of the seats are set. They only need, 218 to control? Excuse me. And all the ones that are left are in play, except for the independent districting commissions. So the effects they're decades long. They're not the next election cycle in 2012. This is long term.
Right. I think that some of the losses this time, as enormous as they were not in a way that shocking, because they were many of them were in districts where either McCain had actually won in 2008, or Obama had won by a very slight margin, and they had been Republican before, and they were either very divided or were sort of Republican districts. So they weren't that big a shock. But what's coming in the future with the legislatures and the governors in the hands of Republicans, especially in the swing states, is really going to be far more devastating over time to the Democrats.
Let's talk about this wave metaphor. I mean, the headline of a Matt By piece in the Times: another election, another wave. And Mickey, you talked earlier about believing that the 2008 election could have been one of those realigning elections, and the realignment didn't even last 2-year cycle. What is a wave election, and have we really had them?
I'm not sure we know what a wave election is. Again, we know that there are effects that are widely distributed and that the margins of victory are very large. But we don't necessarily know what the components are. Political commentators, and maybe a couple of us around this table, myself included, have been guilty of this in the past, like to find big structural shifts that are going to explain what we know about politics for the next 10 to 20 years. And we've heard, I mean, absolutely loopy comments from Karl Rove, for example, that in 2000 that we have 40 years of Republican majority. After 2008, that we have 30 years of Democratic majority and the Republicans are going to go away. What's very clear is that elections matter, this redistricting thing, I don't know if it matters for decades. It certainly matters for a decade because things won't be redistricted again until the 2020 census. And that does create a structural barrier for Democratic victory, but that then requires a different set of strategies which will emerge. And I don't think that we can safely predict Republican majorities as far as the eye can see. We do know that there
or even 2012.
Or even 2012. The economy is one of the great random factors among many in this equation. Do we wind up with a now steeper uptick in economic performance, and then people are battling over who gets the credit as the new Republican House, or the continuation of the White House strategies? Or are they battling over who gets the blame? It's going to be one or the other, and people aren't going to be joining hands and talking about the new era that they're ushering in together.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. But Mickey, talk to me a little bit about the polls and the impact of the polls, the quality of the polls on the national election, and even perhaps, a little bit previewing what we're going to talk about later on, New York State.
Well, there were widely differing polls this year in terms of quality. I would say that there were a lot of polls that that made people believe this was going to be this overwhelming Republican wave in all ways, not just in the House, but also in the Senate, and more so than it actually really turned out. There were some that really ended up having a distinct bias, and I mean that in the statistical sense and not an ideological sense, toward the Republicans in the final analysis. Also, there were some that really just had very poor methodology. Methodology matters, and the robo polls, the Rasmussen type poll, really did not work, and there are reasons that they don't work. You can't really poll anymore without doing cell phone only households. You can't poll if you don't know who you're getting on the other end of the phone, or you're just taking whoever answers the phone, because you're not going to get, a good sample.
But these polls take on a reality that to a lot of folks, and sometimes we fall into this, looks solid, looks in a sense the way reality is. How does polling affect electorates, and how does polling affect elections?
Well, because people people assume that they're correct, and all polls are not created equal. Some were quite good this year. The methodologically sound polls, the Quinnipiacs, were, of the world, were very good. But but people don't know the differences, and they hear a poll and they just sort of.
Do the polls create a narrative, and the narrative is almost self-producing, self-fulfilling?
Well, I think it's an empirical fact. The polls were the dominant storyline of political coverage during the course of this year. We have so many polls now. We have so much good access to it. And that's changed, by the way. I mean, if we go back, even 4 election cycles, it was much harder to get polling data as a journalist. You had to subscribe to it. Now you can find it on Politico. You can get a lot of information very, very quickly, and that was the dominant line. So people were looking at the current state of play rather than how people were moving that and focusing even on the campaign strategy. I mean, this became not only the horse race, this became the mechanisms that you use to determine the photo finish winner. And that's bad political coverage, and I think it was bad throughout this campaign. I hope we get a chance to talk about the Tea Party in that context.
Yes, we will. And in fact, I mean, the polling both sort of primes and frames the discussion and drives it in ways that don't reflect what's out there. It's almost like an echo chamber. You're reacting to reactions.
It reifies positions.
Go ahead.
Instead of talking about a fluid political situation, and obviously, I mean, we saw polls moving up and down. The campaigns do matter. People do listen differently in response to campaign messages. The poll then comes out and says, yes, but none of that matters because we still have this kind of a gap. So it reifies the circumstances and asks candidates and their staffs always to say not, what do you want to do, but what do you think your chances are of changing this margin by the end of the week?
Right.
And that is a destructive way to cover democracy. It takes us away from issues and toward, again, not even the messaging strategy, but the results at the end of the day.
Okay, let's talk about Tea Party. Did they turn out? Were they supported? What's the Americans' attitudes towards the Tea Party? And do we have any historical framework within which to place them? You
Well,
start.
I mean, I think, we saw on the exit polls, and by the way, I never want to see less coverage of polls. I just want to see coverage of better polls.
Oh,
Granted.
thank you.
Granted.
But the exit polls showed us that 40% of the electorate said they were supportive of the Tea Party movement. Now, what does that mean to them? Does that mean they're members of the Tea Party, that they're voting for Tea Party candidates, or does that mean that they're supportive of a movement that's angry, that
somehow
saying,
resonates
that's
with them?
saying we're fed up with Washington,
Yep.
we're fed up with how things have been going, we're nervous about the economy. Is that really what that support of the Tea Party
But
movement
didn't the Tea
means?
Party provide an enthusiasm,
Yes.
a drive, and
Sure.
at least in part led to this enthusiasm gap, which apparently existed according to the exit polls?
There was a clear enthusiasm gap, but I think it's problematic even to talk about the Tea Party with the definite article in front, the
Right.
capital T,
Exactly.
capital
Good.
P.
I think it's
Mickey just gave the numbers for sympathy with the Tea Party, running at about 40%. If you ask Americans, did you actively attend a Tea Party rally? Did you
did
involve
not.
yourself in
Yep.
anything
Did not.
denominated by Tea Party placards, slogans, leadership? That number drops to the low single digits. There are individual Tea Parties. There are literally hundreds of them registered in the United States. There are 527 committees that organize themselves as Tea Party supporters, and they've put money into campaigns. But in terms of a national platform, in terms of a coherent identity, the Tea Party as such does not exist. There is clearly frustration. In some respects, you can see this as the doppelganger of the Hope and Change electorate in 2008.
Yep.
You create a Rorschach blot and you write yourself onto
Yep.
Hope and Change, in that case favoring the Democrats. This year you had the same thing with the Tea Party. It doesn't necessarily stand for anything at this point, although reduced government, a smaller federal hand in public affairs. But at the end of the day, it's a Rorschach blot, in this case focusing anger, discontent, and benefiting Republicans.
But in fact, the benefit wasn't universally for Republicans, because one could argue that the election in Delaware, the election in Nevada, for example, and perhaps the election in Alaska, the Tea Party candidates, in fact, hurt the Republicans and may have denied them control of the Senate.
Which is why I think that David's right. It really wasn't the Tea Party as a party, and that's why when there were Tea Party candidates, they did not necessarily do better. This whole concept of supporting of the Tea Party movement really is, I know I'm supporting some idea of change, of protest against, the status quo. But it's not, I want change again, but not so much I want this party, whatever it is.
Without beyond Obamacare and the stimulus,
Yes.
knowing what the status
Obamacare.
quo is or what that change should be. Most Americans don't
No.
want to repeal the 17th Amendment.
No.
Most
don't.
Americans aren't getting excited about clauses in the 14th Amendment. There are clearly ways in which this goes out way into right field. But at the same time, I think that we have to look at the extent to which the media have created the Tea Party, again, by giving it that definite article, by giving it a capital T and a capital P, and treating it consistently throughout this campaign as a coherent, unified movement. It is not.
Right. I mean, the notion of Tea Party is not party as a political organization, but party as a happening, throwing the tea into the Charles River. So, the use of the word party is different, and they've taken that meaning to mean a coherent political organization. Let's talk about political money. There was a torrent of political money, huge amount of money, most expensive election, and you had some self-funded candidates that were, post-Mike Bloomberg in terms of their spending. Talk about the influence of money. David, Mickey.
Well, money clearly matters. I think you could make the case that money was not dispositive in several campaigns. I mean, clearly it was not dispositive in California. Clearly it was not dispositive in Connecticut. But across the nation, in close elections, there were 527 committees and party organizations.
What's a 527, quick?
527 is a nonprofit organization that can aggregate without limit money to be spent on behalf of issues. They can't necessarily go out after a particular candidate by name, but they can make it pretty clear whom they want you to vote for or vote against at the end of the day.
Go ahead.
And they are now funneling most of the money from the nonprofit side into campaigns, i.e. not the established party, not the candidate spending in a per se sense.
Dems or reps, the money going to?
Right now it's going predominantly, the 527 money predominantly to Republicans.
Okay. Did the Republicans have an overall money advantage in this election?
It was pretty close.
I don't know that they that they did. I think it really was different in different places. It just, clearly money alone wasn't enough, but money is starting to matter in ways that it hadn't. The whole idea of the self-funded candidate, and then certainly the Citizens United decision, and getting this other money that's coming in now, corporate money and money from, money we don't know where it's coming from.
This is our first.
You get the last 30 seconds.
It's our first Citizens United election on a national level, and we did see torrents. And in this case, the water metaphors come back. Torrents of donations. We can't know what they are because they are not now required to disclose. And of course, most of the people who are collecting that money don't.
Thank you. This concludes part one of a two-part series on elections 2010. Micheline Blum and David Birdsell and I will continue our discussion next week. Join us. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.